Your Honor, the prosecution has a matter of urgent importance to bring before this court. Assistant District Attorney Kevin Marsh had been in trial for 11 days. He was presenting the case against 31-year-old Dominic Reeves, a man accused of murdering his wife Elena in their home in Naperville, Illinois, on a Saturday evening in September. The case had been built carefully over 8 months of investigation. There was physical evidence. There was motive. There was a timeline that placed Dominic in the house at the time of Elena's death. There was, according to the prosecution's theory, a man who had staged a crime scene with extraordinary deliberation and then pointed the finger at someone else entirely. That someone else, a 26-year-old landscaper named Terry Howell, who had done yard work for the Reeves family for 2 years, had spent 4 months in pretrial detention before the charges against him were quietly dropped when new evidence shifted the investigation toward Dominic. Terry was now sitting in the gallery of this very courtroom, watching the trial of the man he believed had almost destroyed his life. But none of that was why Kevin Marsh had stood up and asked for the court's immediate attention on the morning of Day 12. He had stood up because at 7:43 that morning, a young woman had walked into the district attorney's office, sat down across from his paralegal, and said 4 words that had stopped everyone in the room cold. "I need to talk." The young woman's name was Nadia Voss. She was 24 years old. She had been the Reeves family's live-in au pair for 14 months. She had been present in that house on the night Elena died. She had been interviewed by police twice and had said both times that she had heard nothing, seen nothing, and had been asleep in her room by 9 o'clock. She had been lying. Both times, and now she was in the building, and she was ready to tell the truth. Judge Sandra Okafor looked at Kevin Marsh. She looked at Dominic Reeves's defense attorney, a formidable woman named Patricia Lane who had been mid-sentence when Kevin stood up and who was now looking at him with the particular expression of a defense attorney who senses, with professional instinct, that what is coming is going to be very bad for her client. Judge Okafor said, "We will take a recess until 2 o'clock this afternoon. Ms. Lane, I suggest you use the time wisely. Stay with us." Because what Nadia Voss told prosecutors that morning, and what she revealed about the night Elena Reeves died, is one of the most calculated and chilling accounts ever entered into evidence in an Illinois murder trial. Subscribe to Sweet Justice right now. This story does not slow down. Elena Reeves had been, by every account of people who knew her, a woman who made the rooms she entered brighter. She was 34 years old, a pediatric occupational therapist, warm and precise in equal measure, the kind of person who remembered the names of every child she worked with and the specific details of what each one found difficult. She had married Dominic 7 years before her death when they were both in their late 20s, and by most visible measures their life together had been comfortable and successful. Dominic ran a mid-sized commercial construction company that his father had founded. They lived in a well-kept house in a quiet Naperville neighborhood. They had a 4-year-old daughter named Lily. What was less visible, what friends and colleagues would only piece together in the months after Elena's death, was that the marriage had been deteriorating for at least 2 years before the night she died. Elena had confided in 2 close friends that Dominic had become controlling and dismissive. She had consulted a divorce attorney 6 months before her death, a consultation she had kept private, telling no one except one of those 2 friends. She had not filed. She had been, by her friend's account, afraid of how Dominic would respond to a formal separation. Nadia Voss had come to the Reeves household 14 months before Elena's death, hired through an agency to help with Lily's care while both parents worked. She was young, attentive, and by Elena's own description in messages to her friend, wonderful with Lily. What Elena had not known, what she had never discovered, was that within 3 months of Nadia's arrival, Dominic and Nadia had begun a relationship that Nadia would later describe, in the most careful and considered language she could find, as one that she had not fully understood the nature of until it was too late to leave cleanly. Dominic had been, Nadia would say, extraordinarily good at making things seem reasonable, at making her feel chosen, at framing what they were doing as something inevitable and necessary rather than something deliberately constructed. She had been 23 years old, living in someone else's house in a city she had moved to from out of state. And the man of that house had told her, with great conviction and apparent sincerity, that his marriage was already over and that Elena knew it too. Nadia had believed him. She had wanted to believe him. The plan, when Dominic first described it to her, had not been presented as a plan. It had been presented as a conversation, a what-if, a hypothetical. And by the time it became something more concrete than a hypothetical, Nadia was in a position that she had not seen coming and did not know how to get out of. What Dominic had told her, over several conversations across the 2 months preceding Elena's death, was that Elena had discovered the relationship and was going to use it to take Lily in the divorce. That Elena had evidence, that if he simply left, he would lose his daughter and his company and everything he had spent his life building. That there was only one way to protect what mattered. That he needed Nadia to do one specific thing on one specific evening. And that after it was over, they would leave Naperville together and start somewhere new. Nadia had not agreed. She had said no. She had said it 3 times across 3 conversations. And then, on a Thursday evening 2 weeks before Elena died, Dominic had shown Nadia a series of photographs on his phone, photographs that, he told her quietly and without particular emphasis, he had taken over the previous several months without her knowledge. Photographs that would, if shared with the au pair agency, result in her immediate termination and possible criminal exposure for conduct she had not initiated and did not believe was her fault. He had not threatened her explicitly. He had simply shown her the photographs and let her understand. She had understood. Subscribe to Sweet Justice right now if you have not already. Because what Dominic asked Nadia to do on the night Elena died is the detail that explains everything about how a crime scene can look like one thing and be something else entirely. What Dominic needed from Nadia was not participation in the act itself. He was very specific about that. Specific in a way that Nadia would later recognize as deliberate, as a legal calculation rather than a moral one. He did not ask her to be present. He asked her to do 2 things. The first was to confirm to the police, if asked, that she had been asleep in her room by 9 o'clock and had heard nothing unusual that evening. The second was to unlock the side gate of the property at 8:15 and leave it unlocked, a gate that normally required a key code, so that the crime scene, when investigators arrived, would show a point of entry consistent with an intruder. The intruder he had in mind was Terry Howell. Dominic had thought about Terry carefully. Terry was young, had a minor prior offense on his record from his early 20s, had access to the property on a regular basis, and had, Dominic knew, been seen by a neighbor having a brief argument with Elena about a billing dispute 3 weeks earlier. Terry was not guilty of anything. He was a young man who showed up on time, did his work carefully, and had never given anyone a genuine reason to look at him twice. But he was available as an explanation, and in Dominic Reeves's calculation, available was enough. Dominic had used a small amount of Elena's blood, obtained in the most cold and deliberate way imaginable. From a bandage in the household trash following a minor kitchen cut Elena had treated herself 2 weeks before her death. To place a partial transfer on the handle of Terry Howell's work van. Not enough to be conclusive on its own. Enough. Combined with the unlocked gate and the neighbor's account of the billing argument, to make Terry Howell the first name that came up when investigators started asking questions. It had worked. For 4 months it had worked completely. Terry had been arrested. The investigation had focused on him. Dominic had cooperated fully with police, grieved publicly and visibly, and arranged for Lily to stay with Elena's parents while the case proceeded. A gesture that had been widely interpreted as the act of a devastated husband trying to hold a family together. And Nadia Voss had said nothing. For 4 months and 11 days of trial, she had said nothing. Until 7:43, on the morning of day 12, when she had walked into the district attorney's office and sat down. Kevin Marsh had spent the recess Judge Okafor granted him in a conference room with Nadia, his chief investigator, and a deputy district attorney who specialized in witness cooperation. He had listened to Nadia's account in full, asked it to be recorded, asked her to sign a sworn preliminary statement, and spent 45 minutes assessing the specific question that every prosecutor faces when a new witness appears mid-trial. Was she telling the truth? The answer, in Nadia's case, was supported by several things that went beyond the account itself. The first was the unlocked gate, a detail that had been in the original crime scene report and that investigators had never fully explained, since the gate showed no signs of forced entry and the key code had not been used. The second was the blood transfer on Terry Howell's van, which forensic analysis had flagged at the time as unusual in its placement and quantity, but which had not been sufficient on its own to clear Terry. The third was a series of text messages between Nadia and Dominic in the 2 months before Elena's death. Messages that Nadia had not deleted because she had understood, somewhere beneath the fear that she might need them, that contained the kind of layered, indirect communication that meant nothing on its own but became unmistakable in the context of what she was now saying. Kevin had the text messages in discovery. He had reviewed them. He had not known what they meant. He knew now. He had also, in the 45 minutes of that recess conference, made a decision that he would later describe as the most consequential judgment call of his prosecutorial career. He had decided to put Nadia on the stand that afternoon, not in 3 days after a formal cooperation agreement was negotiated and filed. That afternoon. Because the longer Nadia sat outside that courtroom without testifying, the more time Patricia Lane had to find a way to preempt what she was going to say. Kevin wanted Nadia's account to land before the defense had time to construct a full response. He had offered Nadia a cooperation agreement, a formal reduction of her potential exposure, in exchange for complete and truthful testimony. Nadia had accepted it. She had signed. She had sat in the witness waiting room for 2 hours while Kevin prepared his examination. Patricia Lane had spent those same 2 hours doing what defense attorneys do when the ground shifts beneath them, building the best response available from the materials at hand. She had called her investigator. She had reviewed everything she knew about Nadia Voss. She had constructed a cross-examination strategy in 2 hours that she acknowledged privately, in a conversation with her co-counsel, was the hardest thing she had built in 20 years of practice. When court reconvened at 2 o'clock, the gallery had grown. Word had moved through the courthouse in the way that word moves through courthouses, quietly, specifically, and with complete accuracy, and the seats that had been half empty that morning were now full. Do not go anywhere. Subscribe to Sweet Justice right now, because the moment Nadia Voss walked into that courtroom and took the oath is the moment this trial became something that nobody in that building forgot. Nadia took the stand at 2:17. She was composed in the way that people are composed when composure is the only thing they have left. Not calm exactly, but controlled. She sat down, placed her hands on the railing, and looked at Kevin Marsh. Kevin said, "Ms. Voss, today you were interviewed twice by law enforcement regarding the events of the night of September 14th. On both occasions you stated that you had been asleep in your room by 9 o'clock and had heard nothing unusual. Was that testimony truthful?" Nadia said, "No, it was not." Kevin said, "What is the truth?" And Nadia told it. The direct examination lasted 3 hours. Kevin walked Nadia through every element of her account, the relationship with Dominic, the conversations in which the plan had been presented and then escalated, the photographs and what Dominic had used them for, the unlocked gate, and the 2 police interviews in which she had repeated the lie she had been given. She was specific. She was consistent. She did not minimize her own role, and she did not dramatize it. She answered each question with the precision of someone who has made the decision to tell the complete truth and understands that the only way to honor that decision is to tell it, without editing. When Kevin asked her why she had stayed silent for 4 months while Terry Howell sat in pretrial detention, Nadia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Because I was afraid, and because I had already said it once to the police, and I did not know how to unsay it. And because I told myself that the evidence would be enough to clear him without me, that I would not need to be the one." She paused. "I was wrong about that, and I have not had a single night of sleep since. The moment I understood I was wrong, Kevin asked what had changed on the morning she walked into the district attorney's office. Nadia said, "I watched Terry Howell's mother testify 2 days ago. She sat in that chair and described what the last 4 months had done to her son. And I understood that I was the reason she was sitting there. Not Dominic alone. Me as well. And I decided that I could not be that person anymore." The courtroom was completely silent. Patricia Lane's cross-examination began at 5:30 that evening and continued through the following morning, a total of 4.5 hours that represented the most sustained and precise dismantling attempt Kevin Marsh had ever watched from the prosecution side of a courtroom. Patricia was brilliant. She challenged the cooperation agreement, framing it as a transaction in which Nadia had exchanged a story for legal protection. She challenged the credibility of a witness who had lied to police twice and was now asking a jury to believe her third version of events. She challenged the text messages, arguing that their indirect language was equally consistent with a romantic relationship and an affair conducted in secrecy, as with any criminal planning. She asked Nadia, directly and repeatedly, whether she had fabricated elements of her account to minimize her own role in what had happened. Nadia answered every question. She did not deflect. She acknowledged that the cooperation agreement existed and described its exact terms. She said that she had lied twice and was now telling the truth, and that the jury would need to decide which account was credible. She said that the text messages meant what they meant, and that the context of what she had just told the court was the only framework in which they made sense. She said that she had not fabricated anything, and that if minimizing her own role had been her goal, she would not have walked into the district attorney's office voluntarily to describe her own conduct. Patricia asked, "Ms. Voss, you are asking this jury to convict a man of murder based primarily on the testimony of a witness who has admitted to lying twice and who has received a legal benefit in exchange for her current account. Is that correct?" Nadia said, "I am asking this jury to consider what I have told them alongside everything else in evidence in this case. The unlocked gate, the blood transfer, the text messages. I am one piece of what is in front of them, not the only piece," Patricia said. "But without you, the prosecution has a circumstantial case. With you, they have a narrative. And you built that narrative this morning in exchange for a reduced charge." Nadia looked at her. She said, "I built nothing this morning. What happened in that house on September 14th happened whether I told it or not. I am describing it. That is different from building it." Patricia moved on. But the jury had heard that answer, and several of them had written something in their notebooks. The defense called 2 witnesses. The first was a digital forensics expert, who testified that the text messages between Nadia and Dominic were consistent with an affair conducted in secrecy and did not contain any language that unambiguously referenced criminal planning. The second was a psychologist who testified about the phenomenon of witness false memory and the specific ways in which stress and fear could distort recollection. Dominic Reeves did not testify. Closing arguments came on a Thursday. Kevin Marsh spoke for 55 minutes. He walked the jury through the full timeline: Elena's death, the staged crime scene, the blood transfer on Terry Howell's van, the unlocked gate, and Nadia's testimony, and framed each piece of evidence against the others, showing how they formed a picture that was coherent only if Dominic Reeves was at the center of it. He said, "The defense has asked you to disbelieve Nadia Voss because she lied before she told the truth. I would ask you to consider why she lied. She lied because a man had photographs of her and had made clear what he would do with them if she did not cooperate. She lied because she was 23 years old and afraid. And she told the truth because she watched Terry Howell's mother sit in that chair and could not remain the reason she was there. That is not the testimony of someone who has fabricated a story for personal benefit. That is the testimony of someone who finally found something stronger than her fear." Patricia Lane's closing was 70 minutes and argued with considerable skill that reasonable doubt lived in every gap between Nadia's 2 prior statements and her current account. She asked the jury to hold the prosecution to its burden. She reminded them that Dominic Reeves had cooperated with investigators, had made no attempt to flee, and had maintained his innocence throughout. She said that the case against him rested on the word of a woman who had every reason to shift blame away from herself and onto the man she had been involved with. The jury deliberated for 16 hours across 2 days. They sent out 4 questions. The first asked for Nadia's testimony regarding the unlocked gate to be read back in full. The second asked for the forensic report on the blood transfer to be provided in writing. The third asked whether the cooperation agreement Nadia had signed was binding regardless of the verdict. The fourth, the question that made Kevin Marsh sit forward in his seat when he read it, asked the judge whether the jury was permitted to consider Dominic's decision not to testify in their deliberations. Judge Okafor's response to the fourth question was careful and precise. She told the jury that they could not draw an adverse inference from a defendant's choice not to testify. She told them the law required them to evaluate only the evidence presented. She told them to return to deliberations. They returned a verdict. 6 hours later, the foreperson, a retired teacher named George Walsh, stood in the jury box and read the verdict form in a voice that was unhurried and completely clear. On the charge of first-degree murder of Elena Reeves, we the jury find the defendant, Dominic Reeves, guilty. Dominic sat completely still. Patricia Lane placed her pen down on her legal pad. In the gallery, Terry Howell, who had spent 4 months in pretrial detention for a crime constructed to implicate him, pressed both hands flat against his thighs and looked at the floor. Judge Okafor sentenced Dominic Reeves to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At sentencing, she said, "The deliberateness of what was done in this case, not only to the victim, but to an innocent man whose freedom was used as a prop in the concealment of this crime, places this offense at the most serious end of the spectrum this court is called upon to evaluate." Nadia Voss received a sentence of 2 years probation under the terms of her cooperation agreement. She was required to complete community service, attend counseling, and remain in the jurisdiction. For the duration of her probation, she has not spoken publicly about the case. Terry Howell gave a statement on the courthouse steps after sentencing. He stood in the November cold without a jacket and spoke for 3 minutes. He said he did not want to talk about what the 4 months had cost him. That would take longer than 3 minutes, and a courthouse steps was not the right place for it. He said he wanted to say one thing. He said, "I want people to understand that what happened to me can happen to anyone. Someone built a story around me using a gate and a van door and a billing argument, and I spent 4 months in a cell because of it. The only reason I am standing here is because a young woman finally decided the truth mattered more than her fear." He stopped. He looked at the courthouse doors. Then he said, "I hope she finds a way to live with what she chose. Both of what she chose." He walked away from the microphone without taking questions. That is sweet justice at its most human. Not clean. Not simple. Not a story where every person who does the right thing did the right thing from the beginning. A story where truth arrives. Late costs something real and matters anyway. Subscribe to Sweet Justice for new courtroom stories every day. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Hit that bell and stay with us. We will see you very soon.